Okay, hi. If you're joining us right now, this is the Tempest debrief of the DSA 2021 National Convention. My name is Andy. I am a member of Madison Area DSA and also the Tempest Collective, and I'm here with Haley. You want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Haley. I'm with NYC DSA and with Tempest.
So we're going to go over the last 2 days of the DSA convention. We did two segments before, one on the first day, one on days 2 and 3. So this is going to cover 4 and 5, and then we'll give some kind of parting thoughts about the convention. So so where we left on Saturday had been dealing with a lot of the Constitution and bylaw amendments. And into Saturday morning, we started by talking, I think, finishing up some of those constitutional amendments, and then going into the National Political Committee's recommendations. So the NPC, 2 weeks before the convention began, dropped a 44-page document full of their recommendations to the convention, which included a number of resolutions and also constitution bylaw changes. So they initially presented those and put them on the agenda to be voted on, but that actually violated the DSA Constitution. So the convention was not permitted to take up business on constitution and bylaw changes. All the same, they wanted to have the convention delegates look over and discuss them and vote on the resolutions, which were basically resolving that we would want the next NPC to go down and execute the things that they themselves had presented to the delegation. So it was a little weird. It came up. People had been objecting to this throughout the week. So there was an objection early on the very first day on Sunday about this item coming up. And then again on, I want to say Thursday, when the agenda was approved. So as soon as this item came up on the actual agenda, it was objected to again. So none of those objections were put up by us, but when this one came up on Saturday, we felt it was useful to support it because basically we didn't have that much time at a convention, and we were going to be discussing something that the NPC had created for us to rubber stamp and then give back to them to go do. So it wasn't really necessary. It just felt like, a little bit of a show, in my opinion. But anyway, so we did debate them anyway. They came up, and the convention basically gave the thumbs up on all of them to go forward. Um, let's see, and then we finished with some more constitution changes and went into the DSA platform. So to this point, actually, every single constitution or bylaw change that was proposed to the convention has failed, except for one, which was just like removing the location restriction from the Constitution. So it doesn't matter what political tendency or caucus or group you were part of, every single one of them failed. So nobody was able to amend the Constitution to do anything. We'll come back to that in some of the analysis, but I think that is important, is that there were 5 of these, I want to say 5 that were presented, and none of them made it through. The platform came up. It had a couple of amendments to the platform. The most significant, I think, was that the International Committee put forward an amendment to insert basically the same language of Resolution 14, which had previously been debated, into the platform. So stating that DSA is going to make relationships with mass parties. So that came up. It was 5-4, and it did go into the platform. So that language has been amended. And then everything passed, and the platform was adopted. And we ended by beginning the debate on the electoral resolutions about what DSA's electoral orientation would be. So I'll hand it off to Haley now.
Okay, as you can see, we're going to try to go through these a little bit more quickly so that we can get to the actual takeaways. But for the last day of the convention, the night before, we'd had the opportunity to vote on the NPC candidates. Some of them gave theirs, or all of them gave their statements. And the final results basically were a breakdown like this. 3 of the 3 Bread and Roses members who ran got in. 3 out of the 3 for the Green New Deal got in. 3 out of 5 for Socialist Majority Caucus got in. 2 of 2 for Renewal got in. 3 others that had run ended up not being able to run or dropping out. The 1 Emerge candidate who ran got in, and 1 for LSC, and 3 out of the 5 independent candidates. So it's a pretty mixed group of all the different caucuses as far as who has gotten into positions on the NPC. In terms of the actual amendments that we talked about, the first was Resolution 8 toward a masked party in the United States, which was basically a proposal for an electoral priority campaign. So basically to make elections the main priority or one of the top priorities for the next 2 years for DSA, to develop infrastructure around that, and with language basically saying that the Democratic Party ballot line is the main line that we'd be running in, with no language about independent runs. There were a few amendments. One was Amendment 5, which would have put in language kind of more specifying the need for a break with the Democratic Party. And the 6th one was basically trying to give standards of what we would want candidates, or what we would urge candidates. In other words, not mandatory language, but language to urge candidates to constantly raise the fact that the Democratic Party has been an obstacle, or that there's the need ultimately for a mass independent party. And so both of the amendments amending that language failed, and Resolution 8 passed unamended. Then Resolution 23 was discussed, which was on childcare for all. That resolution passed. Resolution, Constitutional Bylaw Amendment 8, which would have been to change the language within the Constitution so that membership supports, or is basically supporting whatever the platform that the NPC puts out. That amendment failed. There's a Resolution 20 on building power in the tenants movement. There was an amendment, Amendment 9, which basically had language which said that there would be a legal aid provided through, or legal aid services provided to tenants through the DSA. The authors clarified that that wasn't actually the intention of the resolution, but I think in part because that was the actual written language, it ended up not passing, but the actual full resolution, Resolution 20, also ended up failing. Some of the arguments around that had to do with the question of whether we should be adopting a sort of legal aid model, but also whether or not the sort of like NGO model of approaches to the tenants' rights movement has been effective or not. So there was some debate about that, but the resolution ended up failing. Resolution 30, strengthening DSA from the bottom up through matching funds for chapters and hiring staff. That resolution passed. This was a resolution that kind of does exactly what it says in the title, hiring more staff for nationals through matching fund, or through national chapters through matching funds. One of the debates around that revolved around the fact that DSA staff had not themselves been approached about this resolution or about the addition of staff. And of course, DSA staff is unionized. So, the argument was basically that politically, this would not be something that the union would want to, or that basically that the people putting the resolution forward could not speak with the staff because it would have a political impact on the convention. It wasn't really explained more than that, but ultimately this resolution passed. Resolution 1 on defense of immigrants and refugees also passed. Resolution 29, which was stipends for NPC members, also passed, though by a pretty close vote. Resolution 38, which was Tempest resolution for a socialist horizon on the question of independence. There was an amendment to that put forward primarily by members of Socialist Alternative who spoke, even Kashama Sawant actually spoke to a resolution which would have even further put forward language about a more immediate break from the Democratic Party. And we ended up arguing against that along with some others. Basically, not because that's not something that folks in Tempest are for, but really because of the terrain of debate in DSA. I think that the main strategic question right now in DSA is really about whether or not the goal ultimately is to have an independent political party, and that we have to agree on that goal first in order to be able to then have a discussion about strategically how we get there. And so that was sort of the lines of debate for us. Ultimately, that resolution ended up failing, and I'm sure we can talk more about what our takeaways on that are. Resolution 18, which was about an international committee and mass organizing. It basically would have both given more stipulations to membership in the international committee, but also would have given the international committee broad discretion to speak on behalf of DSA kind of independently of the NPC. That resolution ended up losing. And finally, resolution 26, which was put forward by Liberation and Socialism Caucus. That resolution was basically to have more resources for chapters in terms of technical support, but also in terms of trainings and organizing. Because there was not enough time at this point, that ended up being referred to the next NPC. And that was the convention.
All right, so yeah, I mean, if we breezed through that, in part, I'd say starting Saturday, the approach to facilitating or chairing these meetings became a lot more businesslike, where previously, like we spent more time handling some of the process. They were moving things along at a pretty fast clip, like making a lot more use of discretion of the chair to just be like, all right, are there any objections? If there's not enough objections, we're doing this. All right, cool, we're moving on. So that that kind of, you know, lent this feeling like you were listening and like things were happening very, very fast, right? It's like an item comes up, there's a motivator, then somebody that speaks against it. If there's an amendment, then people debate the amendment, that gets voted on. Then it goes back to the original one. We get two more people on either side, and then you vote, and then you move on, right? So all of this, you kind of got the feeling like, you know, you're getting the business here a little bit. Like the robustness of the debate wasn't huge, right? Like on the whole, you're talking about 15 minutes of debate on any item. So if you're, you know, for instance, like the labor resolution, which I didn't speak too much about, but that happened on Saturday. Nobody was prepared to speak against it. So it had one person speak for it, then some silence. Then I spoke against it because nobody else was going to speak against it. And then nobody else would speak against again. So they only had one for and one against in the end, right? That I think made for a convention where like it was easy to miss things, right? It was like, okay, well, while we wait for the results of the vote, we're going to start debating the next thing. And somewhere in the middle of the debate, the chair is going to announce the results of what happened at the last one. So, you know, I think like it was a little bit disorienting, and I like understandably for like how difficult it would be to run something like this, but in terms of like having a sense of like, okay, did we come to a resolution, right? Like we sort of scratched the surface of like what are the base opinions here, and then determine what the standing is. Okay, now we're moving on. So I guess I would have obviously liked to have more time to politically debate, which I think brings us to like the issue of proceduralism, which everybody is talking about right now, right? Which is like, why did we spend so much fucking time on process, right? And it was miserable. Like everybody hates the process. But I think like what ended up happening was that in the absence of the space for political discussion, a lot of the process stuff was a proxy for the politics, right? Like we had so much of it because there wasn't really the like the room to have these debates, or sometimes the form that debate was taking was through the process in the beginning, right? Like the best example of this is people had made up their minds about resolution 14 on internationalism, and we're like, we don't even want to hear it, like we're not going to debate it, right? So the politics becomes first and foremost, do we even have to entertain any minority or well, I mean potential minority, honestly we didn't know at the time, but any opposition view, right? And so the back and forth on that shit is, I think it takes a very like mutated procedural form which nobody enjoys. If we had basically started off by saying, let's just debate this thing or have the space to have the conversation, I think a lot of that would have been absent. And the same is true for other things that came up procedurally, right? Like some of it is just about the politics of recognition. Is my shit even going to get heard? Because if I'm going to get bumped, I don't want to get bumped, so I'm going to try to move my thing forward. Like that sort of stuff happens a lot.
Yeah, I think that's one of the one of the reasons this convention was very difficult to go through. I can only imagine. I mean, I was a newer person, but I've been in political organizations for a long time, and I've been in different kinds of settings like this. I can only imagine if this was the first kind of convention you'd ever been to, and this was like what you're expected to kind of go through to even participate or follow what was going on. You're mostly seeing the procedure and not the actual substance of the debates. You don't know much about what the different caucuses are standing for, or even the candidates, frankly. A lot of the candidate statements were personal bios of things that people felt, but very little of it was actually about politically what they thought was important, or except in very, very general terms. In terms of like, what are we going to do in the next 2 years? What is that going to look like? What are the priorities for the socialist movement, and what should we be aiming to do in that regard? That it was pretty absent, I think. And so it's hard to say kind of what this new NPC is going to look like. But I think our perspective in Tempest has always been that who is on the NPC is actually less important than is there space for members to participate? To what extent is leadership actually accountable to the will of the membership between conventions as well as during conventions? And just the fact that most of or as Andy said, only one constitutional amendment passed, which was not particularly political. It was an amendment to not change the location of the DSA every year, and that passed, and that's kind of a no-brainer to make things easier, but it's not really one that increases the extent to which people have an understanding of what is happening on the NPC, what decisions are they making at any given time. And it's not just to say like, don't trust your comrades, but I think it's really actually more saying we should have more member input in what happens in the organization, more accountability, so that in the end, we actually have more of a sense of, what is the direction that the organization is going, and what is the, if things do change, like, there were people last year who argued that we shouldn't have debates around, electing Biden because the convention had already made a decision about that. And yet there were people who wanted to have those debates. I disagreed with that, but instead of actually being able to have a debate in the open or have a debate on what people clearly thought was a very important question, that ended up just being something that people on the NPC signed on to in a letter instead, and promoted through their position in leadership. And so to me, it's like, whether you agree or not, if the convention decides one thing and there's no space to then discuss outside of leadership, was that the right thing? Did it go against the will of the convention? Do we need to reevaluate where we are now? Or was our position right? Those are things that we actually should have as a matter of course. That's why we promoted, an amendment for having referendums. But I think the fact that those didn't pass was partly because without this robust culture of debate, without spaces for strategy, there's like much more distrust, if anything, so within DSA between different factions. The factions exist. It's not like we have a unity regardless of these factional issues. It's actually harder to say what is the basis of that unity if we aren't having these discussions and debates in the open.
Yeah, so that's what I wanted to touch on for sure, is that if you like look at it and you start by being like, well, see, face value, people voted those things down, it means they don't want them, that's just where everybody's at. Like if you listen to these debates, the things that came up repeatedly is that people were very distrustful of other DSA members, honestly, and like really just we're getting the impression that like if they didn't understand something, that they were suspicious that it meant that someone was going to get the better of them on stuff. Like, somebody spoke out against stipends for the steering committee, and their argument was the organization is too dysfunctional already. If we introduce money into this, then it's just going to raise the level of dysfunction, right? That I think is a really telling statement about like, okay, is like, what are we thinking about here, right? Like when people were talking about recall, the argument was, well, the big caucuses are going to be more able to use this than other people, and so I don't want it then, right? And I think like that suggests a real issue in the organization, right? For one, like what produces that, right? It's the acknowledgement that factionalism already exists, right? Like everybody knows that there are factions. It's just like they don't want to deal with it, right? They don't want to be part of it. And so I think there was a real aversion to introducing things where you would actually have to contend with other political forces, right? Like you'd rather just like, especially if you didn't feel like it mattered, just let it go take care of itself. So that was one thing. Another thing is I think like people didn't understand a whole lot of these proposals, right? Like it's a whole lot of stuff to follow, to read, and there's a lot of signaling that happens, right? And it's like, okay, who are my people voting for? How are they going to do this? Like that always takes place at every convention, but like it does seem really significant to me that like in the absence of a place where you can actually hear what do people think and why are they promoting the things that they are, right, in a more in-depth way, all you're going to come across with is like, oh, this is a power struggle and I don't want to promote more places for power struggles. I don't know the way out of that, honestly, right? Like, I don't think that that's just like, you know, we say we have radical love for each other and then that solves it, right? It's like there's actual disagreements happening. And I actually think that like the approach that, you know, the leadership groups took in this is that it's going to make this worse. What I mean is that there were multiple resolutions that were trying um, to just agree to disagree basically on stuff and not point out where there are actual differences and things that we need to figure out, right? So one of those being the labor resolution, where it was like we're going to promote rank and fileism and also you know, ally with union leaders, right? Like both of those things are in contradiction to one another, but it was thrown out, right, as like kind of dividing the spoils a little bit. And now that's kind of going to fade to the background. You're not actually going to know who thinks what and where are those disagreements. It's going to be sorted out on something like the DSLC. Probably the same is true of the electoral resolution, which states that we're going to try to build a party, but it says nothing about any of the rest of that. So it's contradictory. It's clear that people have different views about what they wanted, but they wanted to just pass something together and kind of skirt the question. So I actually think that that's gonna make this worse, right? Is that you don't know where people stand on it, and so it breeds that suspicion.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, really what I think is, on the one hand, in the way that you're saying, Andy, there were some ways that things got more mushy out of this convention because there were so many resolutions that were sort of like so-called consensus resolutions or sort of like strategy resolutions that weren't actually clear about like what are the priorities of what we're going to do. But I also think that overall what this convention represented was a shift to the right in terms of where DSA was at the height of the two bumps that it got in membership, when membership grew, you know, enormously compared to any organization on the US left, as compared to where we are now. And, you know, that's probably a function of a lot of things, but just to actually go through what that looks like, you know, in 2019, the convention had passed a resolution for class struggle elections that basically made the default position in DSA the dirty break, which was the idea that we're going to actually at some point break with the Democratic Party. We have to use this ballot line at this moment was the logic, but at some point, you know, we should be running both independent campaigns and on the Democratic ballot line with the explicit goal of creating an independent workers' party. Whereas now the resolution that passed says nothing about running anything independently. In fact, pretty explicitly states that we're running on the Democratic Party ballot line as the strategy, says that that's just a hollowed out organization that, you know, we can just kind of run on and use to our own end. So kind of downplaying what happened in both of the last times that Sanders ran, which was that the DNC totally undermined him and worked to do so. You know, essentially makes the question of an independent party, you know, something we put off for the foreseeable future, something we don't actually say out loud or explicitly, except as kind of like this general goal. So to me, that's a pretty big shift. Another was in terms of, as Andy said, the labor resolution. It's like, you know, there are debates in DSA about whether our main trajectory is around the rank and file strategy, which is, you know, a bottom-up organizing and activating membership to fight on their own behalf. Kind of, you know, knowing some of the limitations and conservatism that exists within the union movement, and is a product of the fact that unions are contradictory, you know, entities under capitalism, because they are not aiming to get rid of exploitation. They are trying to negotiate the terms, and unions are constantly under attack. And so the ability to actually continue to exist, there's a difference between the conditions that workers themselves are facing and the conditions that staffers are facing, and the, you know, ways that the union movement has tried to negotiate those terms really through back doors and through meeting with bosses rather than out in the open. Now, that's not every union, but that's the general trajectory. And one of the big challenges here, we have a resolution that kind of doesn't take a position on any of that after having had a position on the rank and file strategy. I mentioned the immigration resolution. There's actually one that I really wish we'd been able to discuss more on amnesty for all. As being, a more radical position than most of the immigrant rights movement currently has, or the official organizations or the mainstream organizations, and certainly more than the Democratic Party, but it gives us a horizon to be working towards. Instead, what we passed kind of said that we are just going to push, for the most part, for what we think we can get under Biden or for what Biden has promised. So that's a lowered horizon as far as what we think we can win. And then finally is the international resolution, resolution 14, which went from us leaving the Socialist International, basically saying we're going to work with a wide array of groups in previous DSA conventions, to now saying we're mostly going to be working with mass parties. And the, actual content of that, I think, can be seen in just the way that the International Committee has already been working, which is the politics that dominate that, or we shouldn't say anything about, or, as socialists in the US, we shouldn't have anything to say about what happens in other countries or what those parties are doing to workers in those countries. Our job is just to kind of uncritically support them in opposition to US imperialism, which begs the question, are we in solidarity with those parties, or are we in solidarity with the international working class, particularly when workers are actually being subjected to those conditions? So the fact that that passed, for me, all of that signals a closing of space within DSA, or at least a move to the right in some regard. On the other hand, and I've been talking a while, I want to hear what you have to say, Andy. It's just, I do think that one important thing to note is that throughout all of these votes, there was consistently at least between a fifth and as much as a third of delegates who voted against those proposals. So I think it matters for the sake of saying, like, there is actually, I think, the potential for opposition in DSA, but it's certainly not something that's organized at this point. And so that is a big question going forward.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think like the thing about this like shift politically is that well, the way that Natalia said it to me the other day was good, which was, the deed precedes the word, which is that all of this stuff has been happening for some time, right? Like, if you read what we put on Tempest, right, like we do kind of track how there are these movements that have been happening in terms of the international committee's positions, but electorally certainly, right, that there are these new like theoretical and rhetorical developments that are speaking to the fact that people are already kind of decided that they're that the Democratic Party is the place where they want to be, right? The language of that resolution says DSA will continue the successful tactic of running in the Democratic Party, right? Which says a whole lot. I think that that there's a few different parts of this. I mean, for one, like it is reflective of the political situation in general, right? Like if you look at where the convention was in 2017, say, or 2019, right, there was the Red State Revolt and like the teacher strikes that were all around the country, right? That's mass struggle. There was like kind of ascendant challengers internationally, like similar to DSA in some ways, right? There was the Bernie Sanders campaign, and for all of its faults, right, did kind of articulate a certain kind of opposition to neoliberalism in the US. And this convention is now operating in a very different context, right, where the level of struggle is very low. And we're now under a Biden presidency without a sense of an alternative right now. And so it seems like the common sense is cohering around this much lowered sense of confidence about what can be done. I think though that like that I don't want to paint that as automatic though, because in part last summer did provide an alternative, right? And in terms of there's a mass rebellion or like just the largest protest movement in the US history, right? And what was DSA's relationship to it, which was kind of distant, right? Like didn't acknowledge it for weeks and then was kind of took the formal position of let's take defund to the ballot box rather than meet the movement on its own terms. So that stuff I think has created some difficult terrain that DSA is operating on, and some of it of its own making. I do think that it's right though that there is a consistent group that of those delegates that opposed it, right? It wasn't like one person was like, nobody's saying I'd vote against it. And then it's like Hans Mollmann, right? Who's like, I said it. But you do have like a group of delegates who either voted for something that like affirmatively that would be a different course of action, or voted against the like main direction that the organization was going. So that's significant, right? It's just a little bit difficult to like piece out who that is, what it means, and what the potential of that is. Unless you have anything else, there are a bunch of questions that have come in. Should we get
Let's
to
turn
those?
to those. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so first of all, this is incredibly helpful. Is this assessment report written up yet? No, we haven't written it up yet. It's very fresh, so we will be writing something. But until then, we thought it would be useful to just talk about it, right? All right. Second, curious about the international debate. How many participated, and why do you think people were swayed by the soft campism contrasted with who was unfamiliar with history and politics of mass parties in power and just voted with the majority? Do you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah. So one thing to note about that debate, aside from that it almost didn't happen, was that when it did, we really only had about 15 minutes to devote to it. So there were speakers for and against. The character of the debate, I would say, is there were a couple of people who got on opposing it to say, a word or two about what some of these parties have done in power. Like someone spoke to the issue of Dilma Rousseff, and who actually spoke at the convention. And the issue of having somebody who, was obviously like impeached and Lula's in prison. Like there's obviously that context of an ascendant far right. And at the same time, the question of how we got there gets to the conservative wing of the pink tide. That is groups that got into power on the waves of mass protests and mass movements. And then in power actually imposed austerity, opposed abortion rights, opposed LGBTQ rights, a number of things. And so someone raised that issue. I don't know how much people in DSA are actually familiar with that history. My impression is that it's probably very mixed. But that was one of the arguments against. Another was simply actually that people in DSA felt they didn't know enough about the international groups that we would be allying with if we passed this resolution, and what that would look like. On the other side were people basically saying that the international committee's been doing really great work, that this is a continuation of that work, that having been able to do things like go to Venezuela and meet with Maduro were like really good things. And I can't say it was all that much more substantive than that. Obviously, I'm biased. I'm pretty. I didn't find those to be very convincing arguments. I think that there was much more actual substantive debate over the Slack channel than there was at the convention, in terms of what this would actually mean and what it would mean to actually be in solidarity. But to cap it off, I just think that I think that for most people, it's a gut instinct, not like there's a hardened campism within DSA. I think there are some elements of hardened campus in DSA. Campism, for folks who aren't familiar, is basically kind of the idea that like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So like allying with groups that have been traditional, or allying with forces that have traditionally been either subject to US imperialism or have been oppositional to US imperialism, but kind of regardless of what those organizations represent as far as workers' struggle, workers' power, and workers' democracy. So in the case of the Venezuela delegation, that meant going to meet with Maduro and going on a televised tour for the government without meeting with some of the opposition groups in Venezuela that have been opposed to, many of the policies of Maduro from a left-wing perspective, from the perspective of what's happened to workers' organizations in Venezuela. That's just one example. But all in all, I think that without knowing those nuances, what groups exist, what the history is, without having a more robust discussion, which again, without that debate, and that people didn't even want to have the debate, I think that's, speaks to this, this idea that, again, we don't know enough, so therefore we shouldn't have anything to say about what happens in other countries. That's kind of the logic of this. And I think it's a bit of a default to say we should just be in solidarity. And I think that's a good instinct. But ultimately, it doesn't answer the question when there are all these complexities of the situations and of the left in those countries. What does it actually mean to be in solidarity when it's as bad as people, actually having their rights taken away, people being oppressed, people being unable to actually struggle as oppositions in that country openly? As socialists, we should be for that. So I think it's still a live debate in DSA, but I think that that's part of the sort of default logic and why those arguments, carried the day. Some of it, I think, is just that we haven't been able to have longer discussions of that history.
I think that's really the casualty right there of not having a pre-convention, right? Like this is exactly like 15 minutes is not, it's not possible to really get into what is at stake in this debate, right? Like it, the like part that was so difficult about it was people saying there's nothing to debate, everybody agrees. And then we spent 4 days, between Sunday and Thursday debating, on this convention Slack in writing how much there was to debate, and then, like to have it on one side where there's just days and days of writing, and then on the other, people saying that there's no time and there's no need to do this, I think is a real issue, right? Like in theory, what should have happened is we would have had a pre-convention period, and then in the pre-convention, right, we would have actually organized a debate around this, right? People could have put forward like what is it that is being debated, what are the issues, why is this important, what does the thing say, what does it not say, right? In the absence of that, right, you have to make a very quick decision, and usually it means looking to your people to see what are they going to do. So that, I think, was more or less the character of the debate. It wasn't lent very much to like making strong, concrete like arguments about history and about the contradiction of trying to run a capitalist state as a left-wing party, right? It had a lot of kind of like platitudes of like, well, there's no alternative, and everything else is a dead end, and here it is right there, like you can see it. So like, don't be a crank, just like before this. That was, I think, it's a little bit of an exaggerated version of the debate, but I think captures it okay. All right. Was there reference to DSA's racial composition and the importance of that in recruitment? Okay, this is I think a very good and important question right here, because one, there was a number of resolutions that all got put into the consent agenda, and so they were passed, which meant that we never talked about them again. So officially passed things saying yes, it's important, but then never actually imparted that like on the brains of the delegates to say, why does this matter, right? I think that's part of the problem of a consent agenda. But for two, this is an issue that actually came up in terms of who was debating. It was like I overwhelmingly just white men that were debating, right? And at one point someone did raise this and say, who, like what the hell, like, are you going to call on someone else? And they're like, well, the rules we adopted did not include a progressive stack, so we're not doing that, right? And I mean, I think that it was painfully evident during the convention.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, there were proposals that were passed, I believe, in the consent agenda, I think in the language of Beyond 100,000, which is a proposal, basically trying to build DSA as a mass organization that passed, I think, by like unanimous consent, basically. But there's language in that about the importance of building a multiracial organization. There's constant references to the importance of building a multiracial organization. But, especially given what Andy said earlier, I think about the relationship between DSA and the mass uprising last year, like it raises questions about like, well, what would we need to do for that to actually happen, for us to actually build an organization that looks the way that the working class looks, that actually is reflective of it, and it's a diversity, and in terms of all the ways that the ruling class tries to divide us. So I think that there's an acknowledgement of it, but it's not, again, just not something we got to discuss at length. It's important that it was seen as a priority. I do want to acknowledge that, but I think that the finer details of how we did that, are there chapters that have actually succeeded in building, in recruiting more comrades of color, things like that, we weren't able to discuss and kind of take lessons from.
There's a comment from somebody that says that they wouldn't say the entire organization has moved to the right. A lot of delegates talked about our current electoral strategy based on big tent and loose associations are working, and there are anxieties with further commitments to a dirty break. I mean, like this is the always the difficulty with describing an organization that's got a lot of moving parts, is like every time you say, okay, well, as a whole, this is what happened, people are like, nah, no, my one little part over here is not like that, right? It's like that can be true, right? It can be true that a chapter doesn't have exactly the same dynamic, right? But in terms of charting, where is the organization at? There's no other way to do it than to look at what was the resolutions that were passed, right? And if you read the resolutions and then put them up against what the prior positions were, I think it's pretty incontestable that they're much more conservative and kind of appealing to like the old Harringtonite phrase, the left wing of the possible, and that entails a shifting sense of what's possible, less and less. So anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the proposal is basically based on the idea, I'm thinking specifically of Resolution 8, which was the electoral priority one. There's language in there, and it was sort of motivated in the sense of like, we're continuing the big success of DSA. One thing that I think it doesn't actually grapple with is why membership has, kind of stagnated right now. Of course, it's still significant that DSA is has almost 100,000 members. It is the largest organization on the U.S. left. And it's understandable why people point to electoral success as the reason people are joining. But I think if we're only looking at that and not actually pointing to what is the alternative, what is the actual alternative that we're building outside of the two-party system? If we're in a party that is totally hostile to almost every demand, it's been incredibly hard to get anything like Medicare for All passed, to get anything like a real Green New Deal. And I say that because there's also been an appeal to the left in the sense of watering down what that demand actually means. Under Biden, it's basically an infrastructure plan. It's not anything nearly close to what is actually needed to stop climate change and to slow it, as we're seeing the effects of it right now. So none of that to me rises to the urgency. The left wing of the possible, I think, is if it's only dictated by the electoral arena and that's the only priority or the primary priority that we're putting forward, then I don't actually think we're equipping ourselves or organizing ourselves well enough to either fight in all the different arenas of political struggle, whether that's in labor or whether that's in social movements or any other place. But I also think it means that instead of actually setting a lead for what we want to do, we're kind of tailing the left wing of the Democratic Party and what they say is possible. So I think that if we're actually going to continue to grow and to put forward an alternative, we actually have to raise people's expectations and horizons. I don't mean just by voluntarism, but we have to agree about where we're going at the very least. And I think that there's been some backsliding on what that goal actually is, as well as any steps meaningfully to move towards social, the sort of meat and potatoes of socialism, which is like worker self-activity.
Do you see another one you want to take?
Let's take a look. I want to hear more about the Socialist Alternative Amendment and strategy on Democrats. Given it lost, wouldn't it have been better to draw a hard line to identify the left wing of the organization? Let's see, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So I think that, first of all, like Socialist Alternative put out two different amendments to resolutions at this convention. One of them was a resolution or an amendment to the labor resolution. I can't entirely remember it, but basically just, drew a hard line saying that the contradiction of the labor movement is that labor is tied to the Democratic Party and is always, I guess to put it in classic terms, betraying its base in order to, side with bosses and with politicians, right? And that DSA should see that as a serious thing to contend with, right? I think that was great thing to point out. I don't think that they tactically did it in a very good way, and I'll come back to that in a second. The second one that they did was trying to amend the main electoral resolution, not the main electoral. They tried to amend the resolution that we put out, like that was a socialist horizon, and essentially resolve all of the issues to say that we will immediately begin work on an independent party right now. I'm trying to think if there's anything else more complex, but basically that's where it put it, right? So I think it's a complicated question, in part because one, the politics of Socialist Alternative joining DSA has been very fraught, right? Socialist Alternative joined DSA. They did so publicly and basically said we're coming in, right? And I don't think that it was received well by most DSA members at all. It was very much seen as something from the outside, and then they immediately went into wanting to have these high-level debates without, I don't think, really understanding what the terrain is in DSA. That is what I would characterize as my main difference with them, right? Is that it's not that I disagree with them on most of the politics that they raise, but I think that it was not really understanding kind of where are people here and how are we going to clarify some of these questions. So we actually opposed it because our point was we're not gonna win this debate. We're not gonna solve the issue of the Democratic Party in DSA writ large, right? And it's not that we're like soft and we're like, oh, that's okay. We like everybody's cool. Like you should just do whatever. But our approach to our resolution was, look, when it comes down to it, there are certain things that matter a lot, right? And can we get people to agree that those things do in fact matter? Does it matter that you will not vote for an austerity budget, right? Does it matter that you won't take money from fossil fuel companies or police or something like that, right? And like if you put that first and foremost in the skin of the Democratic Party question, everything else gets shut out and by most people in DSA, right? So you are not actually talking about, do these things matter? It becomes a conversation where people have already been hardened on something. So so there's failed. I have the vote count. They got 151 votes for theirs and 838 opposed, right? And a lot of people, I think, very much opposed it simply because it was socialist alternative, which sucks, right? But I think that that's part of the complication here. So that, like, you know, people came on pretty hard, and the commentary after was, I hope that they realize that they're not welcome, which sucks, right? I mean, I think we've defended socialist alternative being a part of DSA from the get-go. Yeah, wherever we have differences with them, we still defend that, you know, that they should be part of the organization.
Yeah, I think that pretty much covers that. Let me see if there's another one. There's some comments here. The lack of a central organ of DSA to publish strategic proposals really hamstrings serious debate. Publishing on caucus websites doesn't build an organizational history. Yeah, I think that is actually a really big challenge. In fact, you know, you would think the convention would be the main place where you get to have these debates and discussions, you know, among the whole organization. And, you know, to the extent to which it exists is just very limited, as we've said before. So I would agree, it'd be really great. I think it, you know, we do things like this event tonight, these live streams, we do similar events on other, you know, debates on the left or strategy questions and things like that. Part of the reason Tempest exists at all is because we know we haven't been able to have these really, for the most part, inside DSA. And it'd be great if instead of having, you know, a debate on any number of the questions we just raised, even if it's electoral, if it's on, you know, international questions, on anything else, that there's actually space to do that inside DSA already, so that it's open and people can all participate and be on the same level in terms of their knowledge of the debates and, you know, where things are headed. But yeah, very often it's like you're replying to a debate that exists on the left or exists in one publication or another, and then the reply to that happens in a completely different place, and you have to read like 5 different, you know, publications. It's both good to me that there is this proliferation of left-wing publications, and at the same time it is, at least in DSA, a real weakness that there isn't, you know, a singular place to have those out. So that if someone wants to try to do that, that would be a really good thing to try to do.
I mean, in general, I think that part of the problem with DSA, and this is kind of true of like DSA kind of follows in some ways the Socialist Party model, right? Like the Socialist Party of America model from Deb's time, and it's a generally a weak central organization, right? And then a proliferation of like independent newspapers and magazines and things like that, right? Which is, you know, it's got its strengths and weaknesses, but one of them is that you know, it doesn't have a clear way of being able to have this debate, right? Unless people agree to it. And I think some people they just don't want to have that conversation. Like Haley said, that is part of why we started this publication, was that there were things that were just like, are we just not going to talk about that? Like, so whatever, we'll bring it up. Okay, so somebody's asking, if there was a pre-convention, would it have taken place online? How would it have happened? You know, I think like, it's hard to retroactively say like what would a good pre-convention have looked like. But, you know, first of all, I think that one of the real downsides of the culture of DSA is everything is instantaneous, right? Like so much of the way that we handle political discussion in DSA is like hot takes on Twitter, right? Where it's like instant, and then somebody responds and it's hot. Like it's not like a really well measured thing, right? Like like a lot of socialist organizations will have a bulletin, right, or something like that, which is it asks you to be more deliberate and to consider, and then they go out periodically, right? Like granted, like that's got its own baggage from organizations in the past, but I think my point is that like a pre-convention period usually does two things, right? It has a written form where people talk at length and then can actually defend their positions and people can respond to them, right? And it does that in a way that it's distributed so people know. And then the other part of it is that it would have meetings, right? And I think that the NPC did say that they considered, okay, would we do regional meetings that would be, potentially in person, depending on the status of COVID. That could have happened. The pre-conventions did happen, but the problem with them wasn't that like they were online per se. It was that they didn't actually take up any of the political questions at all, right? Is that they were workshops on how to do Robert's rules, or a lot of them where here is an overview of what we're doing with the PRO Act, right? Those aren't actually related to deliberation over the convention items. So I think that that's the big difference.
Yeah, I just add also, to me, a pre-convention can also be a period, not just to say like, here's my argument and here's my assessment fully formed, because really we're all, working in very different areas of work. We're all in different states. We're all facing different challenges in the work we do. I think a pre-convention can sometimes be a period to get, just reports out and to have a better sense, that isn't just based on sort of like abstracting from or extrapolating from my particular situation, but actually starting to knit together what are the dynamics across the country? What are the different things that are happening in the world? And, I feel like a broken record, but I keep going back to this. Like, to me, it doesn't always have to be, what is it that we're going to do? And just like kind of shooting from the hip and saying, this is what we're going to do, and being able to just kind of plug in. I actually think that, it's kind of that old saying, you can't have theory with or practice without theory, right? I feel like we actually have to have from our starting point an assessment of the forces that we're up against. We have to have an assessment of where we're strong and where we're not. We have to have a sense of where we're rooted in different struggles and where we're not, and have that be the starting point for, okay, what can we do now? And so having these competing proposals, clearly that reflects a different assessment of the world that we're in right now. But instead of having that be the opening and the starting point for us then saying, what do we want to do? Those things are kind of hidden. Those to me are part of the debates that are hidden. It's not just the what will we do, but like why. So to me, that's what a pre-convention period can be devoted to, as far as actually giving people a better sense of what the terms of the debates are.
I mean, even just what we're just saying about reports, right? I mean, like so much of us get our information about what is happening usually through like news articles written for some magazine or that are in like a daily newspaper, right? And so we have very impressionistic views about what is the work that we are doing ourselves, right? To me, the thing that really bolds that point is that people's perspective about what happened with the Democratic Party in Las Vegas, right, is this very triumphant, right? Like, oh, DSA did all these things, right? It would be very useful to hear a report about what that is, so that way people can actually decide, right? Like, what was this a piece that was like designed to sell papers when it was written so that it's like kind of exaggerated, or is it really useful, right? Like, did it capture like the dynamics on the ground. Like those are all important things, and considering how much work there is, like I think that we're doing ourselves a disservice when we don't have some mechanism to actually talk about what we're doing and give some evaluations on it.
Let's see, I'm going to go back to our questions here. I'd be interested in learning how to effectively engage and relate to DSA in a principled way. Any suggestions? Yeah, I mean, I think that your principles kind of have to come from analysis, theory, history, right? Like, for example, like, why are we in Tempest super critical of the Democratic Party? Like, it can't just be based on what we think are openings now. It has to also be historically, like, what has the Democratic Party done every time there's been a left-wing opposition? It's either tried to co-opt it, it's either tried to make people feel that that's the only space there is for actual political debate. It's even tried to repress people. So, look at who was, dismantling Occupy Wall Street. Look at who, has actually been engaged in the most deportations. There are any number of things that you can point to that show like the interests of this party don't actually lie with ordinary people, and that when there has been an opposition, instead of actually directing that opposition into the streets and into workplaces, it's basically said, well, you can elect this other person and they'll do it for you. And that hasn't really panned out historically. So I think that we need, a mass organized movement. That's my analysis, but whatever your starting point, it has to actually be, none of us can do this alone. We have to be organized. And that's why, for me, it's like, we may be organized in DSA with very different analyses of what that terrain is and what the possibilities are. But you need to find comrades who agree. You need to find comrades whose starting point is similar analysis and also similar strategy as far as what we think is going to change things. Like for us in Tempest, the strategy, the starting point has to be that there can't be socialism without workers themselves actually being the basis of the activity that they're doing. They actually have to be the ones who are in the driver's seat and deciding what kind of society that they want to run. So no one can do that for us. No great elected official can do that for us. There are ways that we can use elections strategically to amplify struggle on the ground, but ultimately it's that struggle on the ground that actually is the motor force of history. And so that is where our priority is as far as what we want to build and what we want to grow and strengthen. And ultimately through those struggles win people to the need for a totally different society. And like, that's kind of our starting point. I think there are different starting points in DSA, but like, that's, to me, if that sounds really cool, maybe you should get involved in Tempest. Just a big pitch there.
Okay, we're 10 after the hour, so we should probably breeze through some of these. Okay, what happened to the resolutions introduced by Marxist Unity? Were they even debated? So because the agenda was put together based off of a poll, they had to get ranked high enough on the poll, have enough support by delegates to even make it onto the agenda. So the Marxist Unity resolutions, as far as I'm aware, none of them actually made it high enough in the poll to be added to the convention agenda. Their constitutional amendment was heard because there was only so many that could be there. So that was the one regarding the role of the platform in relationship to membership definition. So that proposal was heard, but it failed. All right. I think maybe we'll just wrap up at this point, because I don't know who wants to hear us for another 20 minutes. So first of all, I hope that this has been helpful. We've done 3 of these now. We really wanted to make it apparent what's happening in this convention, and in part because there's such a dearth of information about what happens in DSA, especially information that's digestible. It tends to be either you get nothing or you get so much that it's worth nothing, because you'd have to be an expert to get through it all. So what we wanted to do was say what actually happened and then interpret it, right? Our takeaways generally, I think, will have been that this was a really difficult convention. I mean, I think very few people, even people that got what they wanted, felt like this was a great time. I think that, as Haley pointed out, that the actual positions that the convention adopted generally move the organization right. I do think that that's related to the objective situation that we're dealing with. We're in a different position, and after a year of COVID, particularly, people have been beaten down. And then I think that we do have to acknowledge that there are some really troubling internal dynamics happening, right? We mentioned distrust in the organization, where people are very leery of factionalism or perceived factionalism, but also, every convention since this organization really ballooned has had some public call out around it, right? Where there's been letters that go out on Medium accusing people of this and that. And it's become a regular feature, and that should really, I mean, like, all right, it happens once, you're like, oh no, hopefully never again. It happens twice, you're like, certainly won't happen a third time. It happens three times, it's a pattern, right? It means that there's a failing in the organization to be able to deal with actual problems, right? That people are like, there's no other way for me to even raise this, and we've gotten to this point where I have to do that. So I think that we should be really, really critical of the direction. The fact that we've had fewer and fewer NPC candidates every convention over these last three times, basically, like 45, 32, 22, which then got brought down to almost 19, right? I think that we're having a really hard time now reproducing the organization as it is, right? The organization needs to refresh itself with new leaders and people that are going to continue to do this work, right? If the basis of the organization is some people killing themselves and then being like Superman to keep it running, that's not sustainable. And I think that is actually something that's been highlighted here, right? Is that in part people talked about needing staff, right? Because they have been working DSA like it's their second full-time job. And there's something that needs to be rethought in this way. I'll let you give your closing remarks.
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered everything as far as the takeaways. I guess I also just think, one thing that I'm proud to say I think we did help to do in this convention is to actually, and I actually believe that, like, I don't think we went in thinking we would have, that our proposals would necessarily even get to the floor as Tempest, or that, we would raise debates, but we wouldn't necessarily know how many people supported them. And nevertheless, another way, to that question of being principled, I think like what we've tried to do is actually to not kind of play as much of this, not factional game, but like this game of sort of like couching things. We've tried to be very upfront with where we're coming from and what, issues we think are important. And I think that actually panned out pretty well. I think that, whether or not we didn't actually win a lot of the debates that we raised, but that's less important to me than that we actually got a better sense of what is that, 1/5 to 1/3 of people within the organization who also were not happy with the way that this convention was going, or also felt that this rightward trajectory would be detrimental to DSA. And so we wouldn't have known that without saying it. I think that it's actually better for us to be upfront with debates as much as possible, and to not be afraid of being in the minority, because ultimately, it's not just for the sake of being contrarian, it's because we actually think strategically we need an organization that's a real member organization that engages and activates its members, and educates them and makes it possible for people to feel a sense of ownership and not just defer to leadership or feel that the only way they're going to get their way is by getting into leadership themselves. As Andy said, even if you believe that, it's not actually a sustainable project for a mass organization to have just a few people who feel they can even like survive a convention to be able to get in a position to do that. So I think those are things that, you know, badly need to change in DSA. If they don't, I think that it's a very troubling sign. But I also think that knowing that there are people who feel similarly is very encouraging, and we'll just have to see if that's something that we can, you know, continue to ally around where we agree.
Yeah, I mean, our approach to this convention was to put our politics at the front of it, right? I think that a lot of the DSA caucuses begin by negotiating with each other about, you know, will you support my this if I do that, and will you do this, and then oh well, I'll do this, and we'll pull this one out if you do that. And we didn't want to really play that game. We were like, okay, look, this is what we think, and we're not gonna, you know, go and lobby and whip delegates and all kinds of things. We're gonna put forward our argument, and we're going to say why we think what we think. And I do feel really proud about the fact that two of our proposals were heard at the floor. Like we weren't like, you know, we don't have a huge machine. We're you know, we're like a dozen delegates at this convention. So so you know, like that I think was a important part, is that somebody asked us at one point, well, what do you think about this and that? I was like, well, we put it out. We wrote our article that said this is where we stand on these things, and we did that because that's what we think. We're not holding any cards here. You know, we're here to, you know, make the point and be straightforward and honest about it. And I think that really that's the most principled way that we could be. And when somebody's asking how do you engage with DSA in a principled way, you know, say what you mean what you say, do what you say, right? Like I think the problem, part of the distrust, is that so many people feel like someone's trying to work them, right? And I know I don't like it when I get text that's like, hey, will you vote for my guy? Or, and I'm just like, I don't know you. Like, I don't want to be part of this transaction, right? Like, you know, I understand that there's a reason to do that, but at the end of it, right, it's like, it's relationship building, and people got to know you are good for what you are. All right. So that said, we're going to close out. If what we do, what we've put out has been interesting to you, we really like you to, you know, read our publication, Tempest. It's www.tempestmag.org. If our politics have resonated with you and it seems like something that you'd like to be part of, you know, we'd invite you to join us. That is also on our website. You can do that through there. Yeah, Haley.
You said it all. Thank you so much, comrades. Thanks for going through this with us. And yeah, I hope it was helpful.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.